Hey guys, I'm here kind of making a follow-up to kind of the first video I posted in the advanced section. There's kind of a thread going on right now of about kind of bottom-up approach and what it looks like. So I figured it'd be fun to kind of talk about that a little. A couple things is first, none of the things I've been talking about are my ideology, so I'm not trying to take credit for those things. What I'm going to be talking about here is particularly Mike Tuchschere's approach, um, which he has nicknamed Emerging Strategies for reasons I'll kind of talk about in a little. So full credit to him, um, and as well as where he learned it from Derek Evely, who originally learned it from Anatoly Bondarchuk. Um, I figured I'd also kind of contrast that to the MED approach that has been talked about a lot here. There's similarities, differences in when and why you would or would not use each of those approaches. So I thought that'd be kind of fun. Um, First thing I want to say is, before we really get into it, it's kind of like a warning on emerging strategies. It's not the tool of a novice, and I'll explain why when I compare it to the MED approach. Remember, it's just a strategy or tool in the toolbox. So you have to know when it's supposed to be used, why, and for what population. So if you look at the population that Mike T caters to, which he uses is elite level athletes, so national competitors, world champions. So it's really meant for them, and it's created for that population. So keep that in mind. So don't try to kind of fit a square peg into a round hole with it. Like, don't take this and then go, I'm going to use emerging strategies on a brand new novice, because you're going to get a large backfire, as that's not what it was meant for. And I'll again go into that on that later. One of the things I brought up was um, the biggest criticism of block training or top down is that when you have a plan like that set in place, it has a lot of inertia to sticking to that plan. And so in the first picture I kind of give an example. So at the top of the picture, what I'm trying to illustrate here is I kind of have a roadblock or the block setup. And then you have kind of the start, and then you have a goal at the end. So the goal is inherently to be stronger than when you started. But what I think kind of happens is the problem is you can start going down that road and some things might not be working out. And so you'll kind of make some twists and maneuvers, but you'll always stay within that kind of block setup. So you're never really able to be super agile. Like, you're never going to go, okay, in the middle of this isn't working. What do I do? Because you've kind of already gone down this road, and this road really only has one path, which is like your accumulation, transmutation, realization. So it does limit you. Um, and there's been a lot of talks about this. If you're a really good coach, can you break free of those limitations? Sure. I think maybe you can. However, it's not something that I ever found myself to be able to effectively do. And same thing that Mike Tuchscherer kind of found himself in that situation. And I always found that, or sometimes I think the the goal gets kind of misconstrued. The goal becomes end up going through that plan rather than getting them as strong as they possibly can. So even if you know it's not necessarily working so great, all your decisions are going to be kind of morphed into fitting to that plan, because that's the plan you set out, and you don't really have a lot of contingency set in place. And so one thing that kind of was challenged to me when I was first trying to learn advanced programming and trying it with someone who I had was a competitive powerlifter, and it wasn't really working out that great, and I wasn't sure why. I didn't know, was I just really messing up the block system? Was there something that I was just missing, like that one weird trick that I didn't know about? And it wasn't until I actually saw an interview with Mike Tuchscherer, and he talked about having this similar problem, like almost identical to what I was having. And I kind of had an aha moment, like, oh, like there's this other thing that I can try with this person that might be really successful, that doesn't necessarily go along with the rules and principles of this block training, which is what it seemed to me at the time, every advanced lifter was doing. It's like what you were supposed to do. And so I was put in a situation where I kind of had to just question block training, and I thought it was really interesting. And so what I had is, so on this picture I have the kind of old block system that I was using with that lifter who was, it was kind of working. But the problem was that, like, the developmental phase would go really, really well. They get really strong in the developmental phase. The transmutational specialization phase would go okay, like, and I always kind of attributed that, like, oh, well, that's the high stress, they're not really fully restoring, so that seems right. And then the sport form and realization phase never really came together super consistently. Like, the super compensation never happened consistently. Like, one or two of the lifts would like do really well, and the other one would just tank. And we had trouble putting together really good and reliable meets on all three lifts. Like, usually it'd be like they'd hit a PR on one lift, and one lift would go okay, and then the other was like ah. Um, and so what I was kind of noticing was that um, things would really fizzle out at high intensities. So, but what do you do with that information if you're a block structure? Because block structure inherently goes volume tapers down as an intensity tapers up. So I was like, I don't know what to do if if they're not responding to high intensity. So I would try all these things. Like, I was like, well, maybe if I decrease the stress, maybe it's just too much stress at that high intensity, and it just never seemed to work well. Because then what would happen is the specialization and realization blocks wasn't enough training to maintain the adaptation, and I was lost. Uh, and then Mike talked about this emerging strategies approach, which kind of changed everything a little. And so what ended up happening is I have listed kind of our first attempt at emerging strategies below. So now my question was, people might say that, yeah, you can just still follow the emergent information and block training and get the same result. So my question was, do you think you'd be able to get from the top kind of block structure to the bottom block structure? So the top is your standard, so it's like 4 weeks accumulation, like 4 weeks of transmutation, and then 2-week sport form and 1 taper. So that's your 1 week of tapering. That's your realization block. Whereas the one that we did with our first real successful meet together was we actually did 6 weeks of this first block. We did a 2-week block in between, and then another block of 6 weeks, which was 5 weeks of true training, and then one what is called a flip week. I won't go into too much detail on the flipped week, but and the block in the middle had almost nothing in common with the blocks on the end. And if you notice, the two blocks that sandwich that middle one, they don't really follow your traditional block structure. In fact, some of the things here kind of fly in the face of it, but it was using emergent strategies and kind of following the response that we got to this point, and it worked really well. This person was actually a 62-year-old masters female lifter, and she ended up competing at the regional championship and came in third in the open division. So she competed as a masters and open lifter, and it wasn't even close in the master slot. Like I think we probably won on openers, and then in the open category, the two people she was competing against were in their 20s, and there were three people going into the last deadlift who were all in their 20s, and she managed to pull for that third place, and so she was incredibly happy, and she secured a spot to compete at nationals, which is what she really wanted to do. And so that this quote block strategy ended up being really effective, and I think we crushed like all her numbers at a lighter weight class too. Yeah, because she was competing at a heavier weight class when we were originally using the standard kind of block structure. So she was like 62, and that was the first successful meet. So she squatted over 200, benched 120, and deadlifted right over 300. I think it was like a 308 pull. So we were really happy with those results. And so I don't know if I would have been able to follow those signals that I was getting in the block structure and end up at a result like that we had on the bottom. So I'm not sure if I have the skills to be fully agile in the block system, which is what the complaint about it was, is Mike Tuchscherer felt that it limited agility, and that's also what Anatoly Bondarchuk felt. So just kind of looking at the bottom approach, like if you just look at the heavier the competition lifts, they actually follow kind of the reverse block structure. Like they start out at a much higher average intensity, and at the last one, you have that benchmarking single, but the rest of it's at like 70% of their estimated 1RM for a lot of volume, but it just seemed to be what they were responding well to, and we kind of saw that in the block structure where their developmental block at low and high volume, high intensity always went really, really well for them. So we're like, hey, this is what you always seem to have the most robust response to. What if we just put that as the last thing before competition? And it worked out really well. The light lifts didn't have a whole lot of change. What we found is that no matter what, they seemed to do really well in that 10 rep range on their lighter lifts, so we just left it in there. But what we did is we kind of looked at, well, which exercises are the most effective, and then split them throughout the block accordingly. The medium lifts, again, like these probably follow more of a traditional approach. So like the light lifts they don't taper. The comp lifts actually kind of functioned off a reverse taper. And for whatever reason, the supplemental lifts kind of seemed to do well with a traditional approach. And I think that may be because in that third block with the comp lifts being at a low intensity, kind of pushing the medium lifts at a slightly higher intensity just to kind of keep that adaptation may have been favorable. I'm not really, I don't think you can really make 100% conclusive statements, but I just thought that was really interesting. So I had kind of success with this, and I was like, well, I just want to kind of continue to try and see what we can find out. And now our block structure actually somewhat still looks like this, but there's been a lot of changes as we were able to collect more data and get an even better picture of her response. And I'll kind of talk about how we got to that picture. So I think it would be a good idea just to kind of talk about what a bottom-up approach looks like. So how did that block come about? So originally, the kind of original person behind this was Anatoly Bondarchuk, and it really came down to one question, which was, does it transfer? So he kind of wanted to see, or he had the idea that he thought that some of the current principles in strength and conditioning at that time were too absolutist, and ultimately, if whatever you were doing transferred, that's all that mattered. So he wanted to come up with a way where you could effectively measure transference of training, and then before competition, you would simply do all the things that transferred the most, regardless if they kind of flied in the face of traditional training. So that's all it is. So that's who originally came up with it. And then he moved to Canada a while ago and worked with a throws coach named Derek Evely, who learned this method. Derek Evely has talked a lot about it. Mike Tuchscherer heard about it. I think Derek Evely talking about it on some podcast, and he adapted it for powerlifting training because he was really interested in a bottom-up approach after, I think, reading Super Training, maybe, where they talked about it, or maybe it was a book by Chris Beardsley. I can't entirely remember there. But either way, so no matter what, I think it's important to remember that the main goal here of a bottom-up approach is a framework that encourages adaptability and flexibility within the plan. So something that block training might have been lacking, the ability to be adaptable and flexible to emergent information within it. Essentially, we know the plan is going to break, and we must have a way to adapt to it. So if you plan out a 12-week block of training, how many times has it gone exactly right that you've had to make no changes? And so we know that something's going to go wrong, chances, and we just want to be able to have the ability to react to those changes that are either happening out of our control. And the big thing is, if you remember in the block training video, I talked about using sequence blocks. So things weren't necessarily complex training. So in a bottom-up approach, the idea is to actually use a complex training structure. So you're training everything inside of a singular block, or at least all the skills important toward your sport. Whereas a block structure kind of sequences those skills together. So remember, that may be a hypertrophy block, strength block, and then a power block, whereas complex training would train all those things in its single block. So there's that. So that's a difference there. Now it's kind of, I guess, time to get practical and talk about that. So the idea with a bottom-up approach is you want to simplify it. So we're not going to change the stimulus, so there's going to be no wave loading of volume and intensity. So that's kind of something that flies in the face of block training a little. One thing I actually didn't mention in my previous video is if we go back to the first picture and look at the original block, there's actually wave loading of intensity and volume happening in each of these blocks. So I only showed like maybe what 1 week of training would look like in them. But for example, block 2, that transmutation block, when it's supposed to be high stress throughout the whole thing, I actually don't have a high stress throughout the entire block, because handling 4 weeks of really high stress, a lot of people don't make it. So that stress is actually modulated and the intensity is wave loaded a little. So you might have something that looks like medium high stress, medium high stress, and then into the realization block. So there is wave loading, and same thing with the accumulation block. It might look something like low stress, medium low for the 2 weeks, or it could look something like low, medium, or even just alternating between low, medium, medium, or something like that. So there is wave loading of the stimulus going on. So in a bottom-up approach, there's none of that. The stimulus stays constant throughout the entire block. So the idea here is, what essentially you do is you build a single microcycle of training. Mike Tuchscherer calls this development blocks. And for now, we'll just think of this as a single week of training. So you start with just a single week. And you repeat that microcycle over and over while monitoring the results until a peak condition is reached. So you just hit the athlete with the same exact stimulus week after week until they naturally reach a peak condition, and we'll talk about what that is looks like. And ideally, you're going to set the stress to their maximum recoverable volume or just beyond. MRV is more of a kind of conceptual thing rather than something you would calculate. I think the Juggernaut guys actually calculate this. I haven't actually looked into it. It's not something I needed to do. I'm not saying it's useless information. It's just something that I'm not familiar with. I think they've written about it in their books, so I think that might be something interesting to read at some point. But another thing to consider is, if you can get away with less stress, always do that. So always get away with the minimum you can until that stops working, and then you can up the dose. And intensity and volume selections are strategy based. So like, there is always a specific reason that you're doing what you're doing. And I kind of alluded to this in like the HLM video, where I kind of view stress as like dosage and a prescription. So one way I think about this is, let's say like medication might be a good way. So you have Tylenol and ibuprofen. So you can take 2 pills of Tylenol to get rid of your headache, or you can take 2 pills of ibuprofen. So same doses of stress, 2 pills, but different formulation. You're ultimately trying to use emergent strategies to figure out what dosage and formulation works best for that person. No one would say that ibuprofen doesn't work, and no one would say that Tylenol doesn't work, and that one is useless and the other is the way to go. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the person, right? I know for me, ibuprofen doesn't seem to help headaches if I have them for whatever reason, but Tylenol does. So you're trying to find the dosage of stress and prescription that works best for that person. So that prescription may look very different, but it doesn't matter if it's ultimately transferring for that person. There's a whole lot of other things that go into that. You might be choosing strategies based on ranges of motion versus sticking points. It might be to develop movement quality. It might be eccentric focused, technique focused, whatever. There are a ton of different strategy selections that can help drive the formulation of your stress. Now, what changes with each development block. So you come up with a block of training, you hit the person with that stimulus and you repeat it until it stops working, and you kind of generate a response curve. And then the idea is that the next development block is going to look different. Now, the reason you want to do this is we're trying to collect more data, so we want to have some things that are different. Like, we're going to learn something from that first development block and make changes into the next. And the thing is that anything can change. So intensity, exercise selection, structure, volume within the stress index, it can all change. And those changes are going to be data driven. So we're not going to change them just for the sake of changing them necessarily. So kind of a summary of what we have so far is we're going to build and write a single development cycle. We're going to repeat that microcycle week after week. And the only change during that is going to be the bar weight. Everything else is going to be exactly the same. And then we're going to continue that training until the athlete reaches a peak condition. So now onto the next page, I kind of have an example of what this looks like and why. So like I said, we don't want to vary the stimulus, because the more we vary the stimulus, the more noise there is going to be in our signal, and we're not going to really be able to see clearly what's going on. Because what we want to do is, by having them repeat the same stimulus and monitoring results, we get a athlete response curve. So I have an example on the top left, and this was actually what my response curve looks like. So no matter what happens, if I don't change the stimulus, I always see an initial drop in my training, then I have a climb, I hit kind of a peak, and then I have a small dip, and then I have my final kind of robust peak. And it looks like this every time for me. Now, the degree to which this curve shows up is going to depend on the effectiveness of this training. But it's information that I've collected, so I know that in about 6 weeks, I will reach a peak condition. So I know all my lifts are going to be the strongest on week 6. I know that I'm always going to take a dip on weeks 2 or 3, and I always know I'm going to take a dip on week 5. So that also helps me mentally. So I know my progress isn't going to be linear, but I know when to expect those dips. So that also means if I'm going to compete, I don't want to compete on week 5 because I'm not going to be strongest. I want to compete on week 6. Or if I have to compete on a limited time frame, I'm going to choose week 4 because I know I'm going to at least have some sort of a small peak condition at that point. And so by doing this, it allows us to collect a lot of data. So we're able to get kind of this time to peak. So I know my time to peak is 6 weeks. So if I were to force myself to compete in a 12-week block, I'd have to make some changes, because what's going to happen is I'm going to do really well about until halfway through that block, and then I'm going to fall apart if something else isn't changed. Frequency. So what type of frequency do you respond to? 1x, 2x, 1/2x? Those are things that you'll kind of play around and collect data on. Structure. So what does your structure look like? Is it a 4-day split? Is it a 4-day full body? Is it something a little different? Do your comp lifts come earlier in the week? Do they come later in the week? Do you do a comp lift every day? So these are all things you're going to collect information on when you're doing your development cycles to help build an individualized program. RPE and intensity, so again, what formulation and doses do you respond best to? Stress, so again, trying to figure out the exact dosage best for that person, and then kind of second order effects. I'm not going to talk about first order versus second order effects here a whole lot. And ultimately, doing so allows for contingency. So if you're peaking too early, it gives you kind of flexibility here. Peaking too late, and kind of if you see a distinct response change. So if I see that also, for whatever reason, my response curve is being compressed, like let's say I'm getting that second peak on week 3 instead of week 4, and then also I get my dip on week 4 instead of 5, I can know, okay, my peak is probably going to come on week 5, and I need to be prepared for that. If I'm competing, I know, okay, on week 5, if I complain on competing week 6, I'll have to have a contingency to maintain that peak for a week. Or if I'm peaking too late, if all of a sudden my first peak is showing up on week 5 and I'm going to have a down week on 6, I know that, okay, I need to do something to increase the rate of which I peak, or add in an additional exposure so I can get that peak on 6 and not have it down on week 6. So what does this look like in the long term? So I've kind of drawn out what it looks like. And so, oh, I guess before moving on, I have this analogy. It says start to build your map, penlight, and a cave analogy. So this is something that Mike Toucher talks about a lot. When you get to the point where competitive, it's kind of like being in a cave with a penlight, and you're trying to build a map of the cave to get out or to get to your goal. Um, and a lot of things are kind of murky. So the merging strategies is kind of like your penlight. It gives you enough just to look around where you can start building a map, but not enough to light up the cave to get out by itself. So you need all this information and data that's going to be collected from emergent strategies to start building your map. But the problem is athletes change over time. So the athlete you were 3 years ago is not the same as the athlete you may be today, and those results might not be the same. So an analogy gives to that, it's like the rocks in the cave move around every once in a while. So you have your pen light, you're looking around, you're building a sketch of this cave, you're building a catalog of effective strategies, and then the rocks start to move around a little. And so you're always going to have to be on the lookout for those things and adjust your map and plan accordingly. So in the long term, what does it look like stringing together development cycles? So you string together a development block, right? Then you have some off period of another block in between, which we'll talk about in a little. And then you go into a development cycle after that. And you notice the response relatively stays the same, but the steepness of kind of that curve changes. So in Dev Block 3, for whatever reason, that curve was very steep. So whatever we did in that block or something we did was really responsive. But then in the fourth development cycle, not so much. We didn't really make any progress. So over time, you're looking for each cycle to end at a higher point. And kind of what happens in each cycle, even if it's not the most responsive, you usually still see some progress. It's just building a method of effective catalog. So by doing this, we're minimizing the signal to the noise, because I know what it should look like every time. So if something looks different every time, then it's hard to tell what's working or not working. Because if I'm doing 12-week blocks where I'm wave loading every time, the response curves can look very, very, very different depending on small things you change in that block structure. Whereas if you're not wave loading the volume and intensity, you tend to get a very stable response curve. And so you get to establish the time to peak, you establish what it looks like, and it gives you a lot of information to work with. So now, obviously you saw there's kind of those gaps in between, and so what is happening in between development cycles? So this comes from Bondarchuk. So Bondarchuk was the one who originally proposed not to wave load intensity and volume. So what he would do is he would do a single block structure. So we call them development cycles, or Mike Toucher calls them development cycles. Anatoly Bondarchuk called them periods of sport form development. So that's his development block where he doesn't wave load intensity and volume. He lets them reach a peak condition. Then after that, he would go into a restoration cycle or a restorative block. And what the purpose here is there's 5 main purposes. These I'm taking from Mike Toucher, which are in no particular order. It are to reduce fatigue, restore sensitivity to training, improve durability, develop energy systems, and maintain strength. There is a bit of interplay here. So if you notice goals 1 versus 5, reduce fatigue and maintain strength. The more you reduce fatigue, the less you're going to maintain your strength, and the more you maintain your strength, the less you're going to reduce fatigue. So the washout cycles can have different focuses depending on where you are. So close to a competition, you might be more focused on goal 5. Far out, you might be focused on goal 1. So it's going to kind of depend here. But the idea is that if you want to wash out all the previous effects of the first development cycle, so there's no interference with the next one, so you get a clean signal. If you string 2 development cycles back to back after they've reached a peak condition, their response curve is going to change drastically. So by adding this kind of restorative cycle in between where you wash out all the fatigue, the sensitivity to those lifts, because one of the biggest things too is the repeated bout effect. So if you do a block where they're doing 3s over and over and over and over again, eventually those 3s are going to become less effective. It's kind of like eating the same thing for lunch every day. You might take your favorite food, which might be a turkey sandwich. So you eat a turkey sandwich, and for the first week, every day it tastes really good. But then 6 weeks later, it probably tastes like nothing, and it probably tastes bland and terrible. It's not that the turkey sandwich is any less good, it's just that um, you've repeatedly been exposed to that same stimulus and you've become desensitized to it. So in order for the next block to be effective, we need to make sure that you're resensitized to it. So the restoration block is meant to do that, restore the sensitivity before going into the next development cycle. So in reducing the stress, there's a couple ways you can do it. The biggest idea is to cut out the SDs or the SPs. That's Bondarchuk terminology for special development exercises and special preparatory exercises. The most common way to think about that is that's like SDs are probably your medium lifts, and the SPs are probably the light lifts. So, and he wants to replace those with GPEs. So what a typical restoration looks like is you have your comp lifts because you want to maintain the skills there, but however the comp lifts may look a little different. So if you're really far out from a competition, you might do heavy work, but you might do a high bar squat instead of a low bar squat, so you get a little more restoration of sensitivity. But if you're really close to competition, you might still keep high intensity low bar squats in there to make sure you maintain that skill. And you're going to replace the kind of medium and the light lifts with much more general work. So there's a whole lot of reasons to go with that, and that's Bondarchuk, Evely, and Tuchscherer talk a lot about that, but I'm just trying to give a brief overlook because I can already tell this is going to be really long. So, and then how long is that restoration cycle? Well, it's going to be dependent on the goals and kind of the interplay. So the longer the restoration cycle, the more fatigue you're going to reduce, but you risk losing more strength. So closer to competition, you probably want to go with the bare minimum you can, whereas if they're farther out, you can afford to push the length of the washout, restoration, or pivot a little more. Now, so how do long-term effects, kind of long-term strategies kind of emerge from this? So once you have a good idea of what that person's time to peak is, what their training structure is going to look like, what stress they're running at, what effective strategies they respond to, volume intensity, and also what type of pivots work best for them, or washouts or restorations, you can let the long term emerge from there. So you start with 1 week and then you build out all this information that can help you plan a long-term plan. And so let's say someone comes with a 6-week time to peak and they sign up for a competition that's 16 weeks away or 4 weeks away. So if someone's only 4 weeks away and they have a 6-week time to peak, you go, okay, that's a problem, but you have contingencies built into place. Time to peak is more based off exposure than it is actual weekly time. So if they've done a development block previously, I might do 1 week to pivot just to restore some sensitivity and reduce a little bit of stress. Then I might run 3 weeks of a development block at a 2x frequency, so they get 6 exposures instead of 1 exposure each week, or sorry, 2 exposures each week instead of 1. So they still are able to meet that time to peak at that 4th week. So that's one of the things that you have an advantage of with contingency. If it's 16 weeks, you just have to orient them onto that competition. So I go, okay, maybe I want to put 2 hypertrophy blocks, or 2 weeks of hypertrophy at the beginning, because I know 16 weeks, the math is going to work out a little weird here. So I want to just have them do some training in the first 2 weeks. Then I'm going to have 6 weeks of a development block, have them peak at that block, pivot for 2 weeks, and then run a second development block, bringing them in even to a larger natural peak, with that last peak being on that competition week. So I have like flip weeks, tapers, so there's a couple of strategies here. Emerging Strategies does still use tapers. Those are second order effects. And so those are something that you can kind of get emergent information on and figure out, do they respond to a taper, yes or no? If so, what taper strategies are they responding best to, and then pick the most appropriate one for them. And then kind of what happens if it's 7 weeks, right? So maybe they're finishing a development cycle in that first week, and your person comes to you and they're like, I want to compete, and you go, okay. So that gives you look at it, you go, okay, I can pivot them in the 2nd week, and then I can run 6 weeks of 3 weeks of a 2x frequency. Also, I'm at that last week and they've already peaked, so I'll have to use a maintenance week to maintain that peak leading into competition. So there's a whole lot of different things. So it's just kind of showing that once you have all the short-term information, it makes it very easy to build a long-term strategy out of it. Regardless if that long-term strategy is 4 weeks, 7 weeks, or 16 weeks. Now, I know some of these things might not necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Maybe I'll make something going more in depth, like looking at strategies in my training and what that's kind of looked like going into competition to give a little bit better of a view, but I'm just trying to talk very generally here. So the question is, how do we collect this information? So what we're actually going to do is do things called block reviews. So I'm going to show pictures from Mike Teixeira's app, the RTS training log. It's completely free. Anyone can sign up. There's no catches. It's a really cool log. So the first thing is you're going to just run a single block of training. And again, what we're doing here is we only have two types of blocks. We have a development cycle, and then we have a pivot or washout. So you go development, pivot, and that's kind of what you do. So in the 16-week example, I had 2 development cycles. So the question is, what populates those development cycles? And ideally, what you're going to do is take all your emergent information, and you're going to use this catalog of data of most effective strategies, most effective exercises, and you're just going to populate those development blocks with those. So the first thing is just let's look at what data you're collecting in a single block. So a single block review. I have an example here, and it's not my training, but it actually looks very similar to kind of my response graph that I showed. So this person looks like they have a 5-week time to peak. And so after you run a single block of training, you can use this training log to look at all the information you've collected from it. So first you can click on the 3 kind of major lifts. So he only does this for powerlifting, so there's no press slot. So you have to take that into consideration if you're going to use this training log. And it shows me the response curve of that athlete in that training block. So what happened? So this person, they have a dip, a rise, a second dip, and then a final rise to a peak condition. So very similar to mine, and that's something that's repeatable. Unless you change something really, really drastically, their response is always going to kind of look like that. Now below it, it's got kind of the lift stat. So here we're looking at the squat, and so it tells me a whole bunch of things that have changed. So it tells me first, do I have what's the change in the total between those 3 lifts? So I always want to see that go up no matter what. The Wilks, if they're not competing, that's not really important. Then it shows the net gain or loss in the comp squat or comp deadlift and comp bench. So this was a really good block for this person. Now, 2 things that are really important are actually the short-term fatigue and the body weight. So usually what you can actually monitor, Mike T uses what he calls a track system to monitor this fatigue, but you can also track the fatigue over each block, which is fairly predictable. So if you see a huge spike of fatigue within the block, probably something else is going on in their life, and that's a sign for you to reach out and ask them, because that's going to influence the results of your block. So if for some reason they had a huge outside life stressor and that spikes their short-term fatigue in that block, you can add a note here saying, we might want to revisit this block later because there was something that interfered with the results. Same thing with the body weight. So if they have a block that's non-responsive and you look at the body weight and they drop like 5 kilos, 7.5 kilos, you might go, okay, I'm not sure if the block strategy that we used was unresponsive or it was just kind of interfered with this loss of body weight. So those are things, kind of nice things to look at. Below that is an all lift density data. So this gives you an overall visual of what your training looked like. So the dots show what reps ranges were trained, and then the warmer the color, the more sets were used. So in this one, you have a lot of work in that 10 rep range that was trained for relatively high sets. It doesn't give you it doesn't show all the aspects of your strategy, but it's a nice way to look at it and kind of get an idea of what was going on in that training. Um, so that's your single block review. But however, one block is not helpful. So it's hard to make conclusions from one block. So if someone's getting ready for a competition, what you want to do is actually pull their most successful blocks of training. So the next picture I have is actually one showing this person's 3 most successful blocks for of their training. So you look at these and you try to kind of see what are the patterns. So if we look at these, I'm first looking for exercises that kind of show up frequently in these blocks. So that might tell me, hey, when they have these training blocks that are successful, these exercises show up. So one thing I notice is, we take a look at squat. All right, there's pause squats in every block, either 2 count or 3 count. So I'm gonna make a note of that and go, okay, pause squats look like that they seem to help create an effective block for squatting. For bench, close grip. So close grip is in all these blocks. So I go, okay, let's take a look at close grip bench. And then for deadlift, it looks like actually sumo deadlift. So this doesn't give us a look at the strategies we're necessarily using in terms of specific rep ranges for the lifts, but it gives us some data to work with here. Now, the problem is a lot of people jump to conclusions. They go, okay, pause squats are in there, close grip bench, and sumo deadlift. They are in their most popular blocks, so we're going to use that to populate their best development cycle. But the problem is you also have to ask, are those in any other blocks? Because this might just be an artifact of coach bias. So it was a mistake I made. I tend to use pause squats a lot, so they showed up in a lot of different blocks, and so they were just an artifact of that. They showed up in the lifter's most successful block just because I tended to program them a lot, and they just happened to be in there. So what you actually want to do then is look at a meta block review. So a meta block review is quite interesting. So I have one here shown for the squat. So on the top here, it shows kind of the rep ranges and the RPEs that were used on the comp lift, so their standard squat. And the warmer the color here, the more effective. So I look at this and I go, okay, this shows all their training history. So what we have is kind of this warm spot at around 7.5 to 6.5 RPE, and that kind of 3 to 5 range. So I know that that's going to be a strategy that's going to be effective. So I'm probably going to use a lot of triples and 5s, somewhere around that RPE 7 range for this person. The rest of it is kind of less effective. So that might mean, okay, if I look back, so my most effective strategy is going to be triples and 5s at RPE 7. Then my next most effective is going to be somewhere between, there's going to be really somewhere around that RPE 8 range, anywhere between singles to 5s. Now, so I'll keep that in mind. Now I can look down at the bottom to get information on the accessory lifts. So it's going to tell me my accessory lifts by kind of this net gain. And that's what these colors are. So this like red dot at the top tells me that that block that where I was using sets of 4 at an average intensity of 6.5 is where they had the greatest net gain and their estimated 1 RM. So I know there's been talk about in the past why you might not want to use an estimated 1 RM. And I think if you're in advanced training, it's actually going to be important that you do, because if you're only measuring the weight, pure weight on the bar, especially if you're using a 12-week block structure, you won't know how you're doing along the way until you get to that 12-week block. Using an estimated 1 RM as a proxy in between that point can kind of give you a better idea of what's happening inside of the process. Ultimately, again, the PR at the end is going to matter the most, but again, this is just information to help inform decisions. And so interestingly enough, at the bottom here, it shows that dumbbell lunges and the 530 tempo squat actually had the best gain. However, I'm not sure those would be really reliable data points because there's only 3 sets used. And looking at this, my guess was that this was actually being used for someone who was recovering from an injury. So that gain is probably a little skewed, because they probably started out very low in that block and just ended up kind of very high as a result. So you can kind of scroll down, and you want to keep those things in mind and look at like how many sets they were used in, how many blocks they were used in. So if you just have one single data point, so like if dumbbell lunges were used once and it says it had a very good response, I would question that. I don't think there's enough information there for me to make a reliable decision. So for example, talking about the pause squats, if you actually scroll down a little, if I were to scroll down a little farther here, pause squats do show up, but the problem is they actually show up in almost every single block. And the net gain in each block is actually a little below average. So it tells me that the pause squats are just an artifact of like the bias of the programming or the person programming, rather than that something that's really effective. So I probably actually wouldn't put pause squats in that last block. I'd look for something more effective. And it turns out something like the close stance squat actually ended up being way more effective. It was all the blocks it was used in were effective, and its average gain was above where I would have expected. So that's kind of some of the information you get. So you're going to use this to build a catalog of effective strategies. So like rep ranges, intensities, exercise selections, frequency, structure, all those things. Now again, this is meant for advanced lifters. There's no reason to dive this deep into the weeds on novices, and also not really important, I guess, for people who are not competing. A lot of these details probably don't matter a whole lot, if at all, if you are competing. Remember, Mike Tuchscherer is working with people who want every single competitive edge because they want to be the absolute best they can be. So if you have someone who's interested in competing, then I think all this information may be good for you. Some may think it's overkill, and I think that's okay. Again, I'm not telling you that you have to do this or necessarily that you should. It's just a framework of thinking. I think due to my background in engineering and physics, I actually like to deal with the numbers and things like this a lot. It actually helps me, but it may not help you, so just keep that in mind. Let's see. So I kind of talk about that on some of the other pages. Let's see if there's anything else I'd like to say. Yeah, so when you're populating the blocks in the long-term planning, so if they have the chance to compete, get 2 development blocks in before the competition, you're going to take those block reviews, and in that last block before competition, you're going to put all the most effective elements of their training into that. So in that case, for that person, for their squat, they would, in that last block of training, they'd be doing sets of 3 to 5 around an RPE of 7. They'd have close stance squats in there, whatever. And then I do the same thing for their bench, deadlift, and or press if they're competing in strength lifting. Then the development block that's furthest away, so that first one, I'm going to put their second most effective catalog of training in there. So I'm also, the one thing that helped me is Mike Tuchscherer gave me a challenge originally when I was first kind of talking through things, which was come up with 10 different cycle strategies or block strategies. So you could treat these as 12-week blocks, like you're going to use a standard block method, or if you're going to come up with emerging strategies approach, come up with a bunch of development cycles with different kind of spins on them. So you have all these different things that you can try out with your lifter to start building data on what works and what doesn't. So I kind of have 4 strategies that I listed here that were some of the originals I came up with. He always gives them funny names, so I gave mine funny names too. And each of the funny names kind of connects to the strategy. So the first 4 I ever came up with were Tiger, Montague, Mana, and Hyper. So Tiger, I'm not going to give out the exact strategies, because if anyone wants to do this drill, I think it's you should come up with them on your own at first, and then you can kind of compare them to like what others came up with. I just don't want to like put out ideas and have that like influence you and your creativity. So I'll just kind of talk about how I came up with those strategies. So Tiger was actually a very aggressive strategy, so it was focused on a lot of high intensity work, in a much lower volume. So I kind of said it was aggressive like a tiger shark, so I named it Tiger. It was a very aggressive program. Um, Montague was actually something drew influence from some West Side style training. So it had lower intensity work and it had a lot of work with accommodating resistance, focusing on weak ranges of motion. So, and then Mana was very opposite of Tiger, where it was actually focused on a lot of submaximal training at much higher volumes. Then Hyper was actually a 2x frequency setup. So whereas Tiger, Montague, and Mana all were 1x frequency strategies, Hyper was based off an old stupid movie that I saw when I was a kid called Hyper Time. So it was essentially those strategies, but running at twice the pace. Um, so those are kind of some examples of like different strategy ideas and coming up with kind of your own, and you can set them up so that maybe you have Tiger might have an early cycle, mid cycle, and late cycle, and it could be run in a block sequence. And that's something I do with my strategies, but I almost never run them in block sequences. What I look at them as is just different formulations of the same strategy. So Tiger early cycle versus Tiger late cycle are same strategy but different formulation. So late cycle Tiger has even more high intensity and lower volume work than early cycle Tiger. And I guess the last thing is just comparing MED versus emerging strategies. So I think both are bottom-up approaches and both take a very different approach. So emerging strategies is used to find the signal and the noise. But by the time you get to an advanced training stage, the noise is really loud because things are so complex. You have so many moving parts. So the signal is really weak, and you're trying to find a weak signal in the noise. So you're going to need a complex process to find that. So that's why Mike Tuchscherer has built out this kind of extensive method of collecting data to help find that signal. Whereas with a novice, where you would start with MED changes, it's not very noisy, it's very simple, so it's easy to find the signal and kind of make changes to that signal. So you wouldn't try to use all these complex methods to find a signal for a novice because the signal is relatively easy to see. Whereas for a advanced lifter, it's not so easy to see all the time, and so you need this complexity. So I think the MED change works very, very well for a novice and intermediates because the signal is easy to see and read, right? So if someone fails on their squats and you just look at how they failed, you can figure out, is it too much stress or too much fatigue? Whereas if a advanced trainee misses a lift, there's so many other considerations. Was it the exercise selection you chose to help develop the comp lift? Were those no good? Was the intensity you chose too high? Was there too much volume? Like there's too many questions to just look at a miss and make a really good assessment off that spot. It's much more retrospective. And so I think what happens with MED though is at a point it gets really hard to see that signal. So like you can make those MED changes on a novice pretty easily. In an intermediate, it becomes a little more complex, but I think you can still do it pretty effectively. And once they start entering advanced training, I think it gets harder still. And at that point, I would probably say maybe an emerging strategies type of approach is warranted once they get to the advanced level. And so you're sticking with a bottom-up approach throughout the entire time. But what that bottom-up approach and its application is going to change depending on the complexity of your noise and the strength of your signal. Early on, as a novice, simple noise, strong signal. As an advanced lifter, really complicated noise, weak signal. So you're going to need different methods to kind of suss those things out, at least in my opinion. Yeah, I think the only other thing, there was a comment, I was just trying to make the clarification that I don't, like, if you plan out your programs and then just MED change from one program to the other, I don't think that's quite the bottom-up approach. And I know from at least talking to the people who I believe created the MED approach, that wasn't their intention. So if you say I'm going to go LP, HLM, 4-day split, block, and then conjugate or DUP is kind of defeating the purpose of MED. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't go down that road. And I think naturally it's going to kind of go down that road, but for some people it might not. And all I'm saying is that if you're coming to the end of LP and you're getting kind of a signal to do something else, but because you've already decided that you want to go to HLM next, you're going to kind of change your management decision to guide you towards HLM rather than necessarily following the signal to where it's supposed to go. And that's all I'm saying. So like, with the squats, like I used to do that because as soon as a squat failed, I would always switch to a Wednesday light day because I wanted to go towards HLM. So I knew I needed a light day in there, and I knew that you probably solve the problem most of the time rather than looking at it and go, okay, why did they miss, and what is that signal telling me, and what decision do I need to make, rather than I just go, okay, here's my chance, I'll get a light day, that'll bring me to HLM, and that's an MED change. So that's kind of all I was saying there. I hope this somewhat made sense. There's a lot that kind of goes into this. I guess the last thing is just the blind spots in emerging strategies. So especially at the advanced level, every strategy has a blind spot, and emerging strategies is its need for consistency and information. So like I said, you're hitting the person with the same stimulus each week, and you're trying to develop a response curve along with a lot of other information that you can develop good strategies from. Now, if that person isn't able to consistently train or consistently do all the workouts, then it's going to fall apart. It's not going to be a manageable strategy, and you're better off using a top-down approach. If there's not a lot of communication between you and the lifter, that's also going to hamper your ability to use emerging strategies. Emerging strategies thrives on consistency and information, and it dies when those things aren't there. So that's very important. So you need to have a lot of feedback from your lifter and be able to collect that data. So if you don't have systems in place to collect that data, then emerging strategies is ultimately going to probably fall apart. So it relies a lot, it requires heavy monitoring and a lot of coaching creativity. So a lot of creativity, changing and coming up with different strategies that need to be tested and things like that. So it definitely has its ups and downs to it, just as your typical block strategy does. No strategy is without its weakness, and ultimately it's just choosing a framework which you feel comfortable working with that strength and weaknesses. So that may look different from coach to coach, depending on how each coach kind of thinks and their mind works. So I'm okay with accepting the weaknesses in emerging strategies, and not as okay accepting weaknesses with the block periodization, where that's going to be completely different for other people, and I think that's perfectly fine. Again, it's just choosing a framework which you can facilitate your best work in.